The wind in Redemption Creek was a thief. It stole warmth from a man's bones, snatched hats from heads, and scoured the very memory of gentler places from the land. For 30 years, Alara Finch had felt it steal the breath from her lungs, a constant, rasping reminder of the silence she kept. Her life was a fortress built of routine. The precise fold of fabric in her small draper's shop, the meticulous arrangement of threads by color, the quiet nod to neighbors she never truly knew. Each measured action was a stone in the wall she had built around a single, screaming moment in the past. She was a woman of 50, but her eyes held the ancient, weary vigilance of a hunted thing. The day her fortress began to crumble started with the gnashing of shovels against stubborn earth. They were expanding the town hall, a project of civic pride championed by Bartholomew Thorne, the town's patriarch, whose wealth was sunk as deep as the pilings of every important building. Alara had been crossing the dusty main street, a delivery of linen clutched to her chest, when the sound of a sharp clink stopped her. It was different from the grating of rock. It was metal on glass. A workman, sweating under the prairie sun, bent down and pulled an object from the newly dug foundation pit. He wiped it on his trousers, his brow furrowed in curiosity. Alara's blood went cold. From across the street she could not see it clearly, but she did not need to. She knew its weight, the feel of its cool surface, the intricate pattern of etched violets on its silver backing. A lady's hand mirror, a gift she had given a lifetime ago. A voice, joyful and ringing with laughter, echoed in the hollows of her mind. Violets for secrets, Alara. That's what your mother said. A secret just between us. Anna. The name was a ghost on her tongue. Alara's breath hitched, a tiny, audible gasp swallowed by the ever-present wind. Her knuckles, gripping the linen, turned white. It was a flicker of lost control, no more than a second, but it was enough. Across the way, leaning against a post of the mercantile, was the new marshal, Silas Vance. He was not like the others, the men who saw Thorne's money and genuflected. He was quiet, watchful, and his gaze missed nothing. He had been observing the dig, but now his eyes were on her. They were not accusing, not yet. They were simply interested, a deep, unsettling curiosity that felt more dangerous than any accusation. In that moment, Alara felt the first stone of her meticulously built wall loosen. Nearby, Bartholomew Thorne himself stood observing the progress, his hands clasped behind his back. He saw the workman, saw the mirror, and his gaze swept the small crowd. When his eyes met Alara's, they were as flat and cold as river stones in winter. The unspoken warning was as clear as if he had shouted it across the street. Leave it buried. The linen in her arms suddenly felt impossibly heavy, the weight of 30 years pressing down, threatening to crush her where she stood. Fear was a familiar companion, but this new strain was sharp and suffocating. For 3 decades, her guilt had been a dull, internal ache. Now it was a living thing, breathing on the back of her neck. Every footstep on her boardwalk felt like an approach. Every shadow that stretched long in the afternoon sun seemed to hold the shape of a man. Her shop, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The bell above the door, meant to welcome customers, became a harbinger of dread. When it rang 2 days after the discovery, she looked up to see Bartholomew Thorne filling the doorway, his large frame blocking the light. He smiled, a thin, bloodless motion of the lips. "Mrs. Finch," he said, his voice a low rumble. He browsed for a moment, running a thick finger over a bolt of calico. The gesture was proprietary, as if he owned the cloth, the shop, her. "My wife requires some new lace, the finest you have." Alara's hands trembled as she retrieved the box from the high shelf. She did not meet his eyes, focusing instead on the delicate, spidery patterns. "It's a good thing this expansion," Thorne continued, his gaze fixed on her. "Progress. Sometimes you have to disturb old ground to build something new and strong. But it's a messy business. One must be careful what gets brought to the surface. Old accounts, forgotten things. They are best left where they lie. Don't you agree?" "I only concern myself with needle and thread, Mr. Thorne," she whispered, her voice tight. He paid for the lace, his fingers brushing hers as he took the wrapped parcel. The touch was cold, a reptile's skin. The threat was delivered. When he left, Elara had to brace herself against the counter, the room tilting around her. The next day, Marshal Vance appeared. He did not mention the mirror. He needed a button sewn onto his coat. He stood quietly as she worked, her needle making small, precise stitches. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with everything unsaid. "Lived here long, Mrs. Finch?" he asked, his voice even. "All my life," she replied, keeping her focus on her task. "You must know the town's history better than anyone, then." I was looking at the old survey maps. The creek used to run wider, closer to where the new foundation is. Elara's needle paused for a fraction of a second. "The creek changes its mind. The land does." "That it does," he said softly. He watched her, his gray eyes patient. He was not pushing, he was waiting. He was a man accustomed to waiting for the truth to find its own way out. For Elara, his patience was a new and terrifying kind of pressure. He represented the law, a concept she had long ago dismissed as a tool for men like Thorn. Yet, in his quiet observation, there was no judgment. There was only a question, hanging in the air between them, and the terrifying, nascent thought that he might be the one person who would actually listen. The slow, careful stitches she took to mend his coat felt like the first stitches she was taking to mend a wound deep inside herself. A process that felt as dangerous as it was necessary. A week later, a storm broke over the plains. Rain came down in hard, gray sheets, turning the dust of Redemption Creek to a thick, clinging mud. The wind howled, rattling the windows of Elara's small home behind the shop. It was the kind of night that dredged up memories, the kind of night where the past refused to stay buried. A knock came at her door, firm and steady against the gale. It was Marshal Vance, his slicker dripping onto her porch. He held his hat in his hands. "May I come in, Mrs. Finch?" he asked, his voice low enough to not be carried away by the wind. She hesitated, then stepped aside. He entered, bringing the scent of rain and wet earth with him. He didn't sit. He stood in the center of her small parlor, near the warmth of the hearth, and looked at her. The pretense was gone. "The mirror they found," he began, his tone gentle but direct. "It was a beautiful piece, silver-backed, with violets etched on it." He paused. "I found the silversmith's mark, from a shop in St. Louis that closed in '58. An expensive gift, for this far west." Elara wrapped her arms around herself, a futile defense. The wall was crumbling, stone by stone. "I think you've been carrying a heavy burden for a long time," Silas said, his gaze unwavering. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore." It was not an accusation. It was an invitation. And with it, the dam of 30 years finally broke. The words came out in a torrent of grief and fear, fractured and raw. "Her name was Ayanna," she began, the name finally given voice, a sacred thing unearthed. She told him of their friendship, a bond considered scandalous in the town, the daughter of a laundress and a girl from the nearby Ute encampment. She spoke of their shared secrets, their laughter by the creek where the cottonwoods grew thick. And she told him of Thorn, then a young man wild with arrogance and cruelty. He had wanted Ayanna, had pursued her, and she had rejected him with laughter. That laughter had sealed her fate. Elara's confession painted the scene in stark, brutal strokes. Thorn's rage, the argument, the shocking, final violence by the water's edge. And then his cold, clear threat to her, the terrified witness. "You will say nothing. You saw nothing. Or you will lie beside her." He had forced her to help him, to erase Ayanna from the world. As the story spilled out, the storm outside raged in symphony with the tempest in her soul. A floorboard creaked on the front porch. Both Elara and Silas froze. The front door burst open, and Bartholomew Thorn stood there, drenched and furious, his face a mask of hate. In his hand was a pistol, gleaming dully in the lamplight. He had seen the marshal's horse. He knew the time for veiled threats was over. I knew I could not trust you to hold your tongue, you withered old crone, he snarled, raising the gun. Silas moved, putting himself between Thorn and Alara. But it was Alara who spoke, her voice shaking but clear, imbued with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. You will not, she said, stepping out from behind the marshal. She looked directly at the man who had haunted her every waking moment. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer her master. You silenced her once. You will not silence her again. Her name was Ayana. Saying the name to her murderer's face was an act of profound reclamation. It was the moment the frightened girl died and the resilient woman was fully born. In that instant of defiance, as Thorn's fury shifted to her, Silas lunged. The roar of the pistol was deafening in the small room, but the shot went wide, splintering the mantelpiece as Silas tackled Thorn to the ground, the struggle ending with the heavy click of iron manacles. The days that followed were quiet. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean and the sky a vast, aching blue. Thorn was in the town jail, his empire of fear dismantled by a single, 30-year-old truth. The townspeople spoke in hushed tones, their glances toward Alara no longer filled with the mild indifference of before, but with a new, complicated mixture of awe, pity, and respect. The weight of their judgment, which she had feared for so long, felt insignificant now, could not touch her. Silas helped her. Together, they chose a plot of land on a small rise overlooking the creek, where the morning sun would touch first. There was no body to bury, but that didn't matter. They placed a simple wooden marker in the earth. Alara herself carved the name into it. Ayana. Standing there, with the wind gently stirring the prairie grass, she felt the last of the cold terror recede from her heart. It was not replaced by joy, but by a kind of solemn peace, a rightness that settled deep in her bones. Silas stood beside her, a silent, steady presence. He didn't offer platitudes or comfort, only his quiet respect, which was worth more than any words. He stooped and picked a sprig of wild sage, handing it to her. She took it, their fingers brushing for a moment, a connection forged not in romance, but in the shared gravity of justice delivered. A burden carried for a lifetime does not vanish and leave lightness in its place. It leaves a space, an emptiness shaped by its own form. Alara understood this now. The silence had been a poison, and speaking the truth was the painful, necessary antidote. She had not only reclaimed her friend's memory, she had reclaimed her own life from the shadow that had consumed it. Back in her shop, the afternoon light slanted through the window, illuminating the swirling dust motes in a way that seemed new, almost beautiful. She looked out at the street, at the familiar buildings and faces of Redemption Creek. It was the same town, the same unforgiving landscape. But she was different. The fortress was gone, and in its place was open ground. She was no longer a prisoner of the past, hiding behind walls of her own making. She was simply Alara Finch, a woman who had survived. And for the first time in 30 years, when the wind blew, it no longer felt like it was stealing her breath. Felt only like the wind.